The sun was setting over the human colony world, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The marketplace was full of noise, humans selling grain, shouting about prices, children running between stalls, merchants counting their credits. Yet, in the middle of that busy street stood three figures who did not belong. They were alien widows. Their clothes were torn, their skin marked with scars of hard labor and hunger. Each one carried the same expression of exhaustion, the same eyes, filled with silent pain. They had been walking for days, searching for someone who would take them in, someone who would give them a chance. But every time they spoke, they were turned away. "Please, we just need a job," one of them said, her voice thin like a whisper carried by the wind. A merchant spat at the ground. "No one wants your kind here," he replied, waving his hand as if chasing away stray animals. "Go back to the ruins of your own people." The second widow held her hands together, almost begging. "We can work the fields. We can cook. We can clean. We will not ask for much." A group of men laughed. "You will bring bad luck. Everyone knows widows from your race are cursed. Work with you and crops will fail, animals will die. Leave before trouble comes." The third widow, the youngest, tried to hide her tears, but they fell anyway. She looked around at the humans in the marketplace, searching for one kind face, one voice that would not curse them. Yet all she found was fear and rejection. The widows stood together, shivering though the air was warm. They had nothing left. Their husbands had been lost in the war that shattered their homeworld. Their families had abandoned them, calling them burdens. Now they were far from home, on a human colony, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this place would be different. But the cruelty was the same. As the crowd grew louder, their whispers began to rise. "They should not be here. Throw them out before night comes. They will bring ruin." The three widows held each other's hands tightly, trying to stay strong. But their strength was fading. Among the crowd stood a human farmer. His clothes were simple, his face weathered by years of hard work under the sun. He carried no weapons, no badge of power, only a bag of grain slung over his shoulder. He had not spoken yet. He only watched. Something in his chest ached as he looked at them. The way they stood together reminded him of his late wife. He too had known loss, the kind of loss that eats at a person's heart until nothing is left but emptiness. He could see that same emptiness in their eyes. The farmer stayed silent, listening as people shouted insults. He watched as one man threw a rotten fruit at the youngest widow, hitting her shoulder. She flinched but did not fight back. Instead, she lowered her head, whispering again, "Please, we just need a job." The farmer felt his fists clench. The cruelty of the crowd was too much. He knew what everyone believed about alien widows. Cursed, unlucky, dangerous. But what he saw were not curses. What he saw were three souls begging for dignity. The marketplace grew darker as the sun sank lower. The crowd slowly drifted away, tired of mocking the widows. Merchants closed their stalls. Families went home to warm houses and food, but the three widows stayed, standing in the dust, afraid of what the night would bring. The farmer lingered, his feet heavy as if chained. He could walk away. He could pretend he never saw them. That would be safer. No one would whisper behind his back. No one would call him a fool for showing kindness to aliens, but deep inside, he knew the truth. He could not walk away. He remembered the last night of his wife's life when she had looked at him and said, "Promise me, you will never turn away someone who needs you." Those words echoed now, louder than the shouts of the crowd. The farmer took a deep breath and stepped forward. His boots crunched on the dusty road. The three widows lifted their heads, their eyes wide, filled with fear and fragile hope. He stopped a few steps away. For a moment he said nothing, only studied them. He saw the oldest widow's trembling hands, the middle one's hollow cheeks, the youngest's tear-stained face. Finally he spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "I have a farm outside the colony. It is hard work, long days, rough nights. But if you want it, you will have shelter, you will have food, and you will have dignity." The widows froze, not sure if they had heard. correctly. No human had spoken such words to them before. The farmer looked at them with steady eyes. You said you need a job. I will give you one, if you are willing. For a long moment there was silence. The widows glanced at each other, disbelief fighting against hope. Then slowly tears filled their eyes. Not of sorrow this time, but of something long forgotten. The youngest whispered, her voice trembling, Yeah, we will work. We will do our best. The farmer nodded once. Then come. The night is no place for anyone to be alone. And with that, the human farmer turned, leading the way out of the marketplace. The three alien widows followed, their steps uncertain but filled with new strength. Behind them, the whispers of the colony carried on the wind. But ahead of them was something greater than whispers, a chance to begin again. The road leading out of the colony stretched wide and lonely. Dust rose with each step as the farmer walked ahead, the three alien widows trailing behind him in silence. The stars were beginning to show, and the night air carried a chill that pressed against their bones. For the widows, every step felt unreal. They had been rejected for so long that kindness itself felt like a trick. The youngest one kept glancing at the farmer as if expecting him to suddenly change his mind and send them away. The oldest widow whispered under her breath, Why would a human do this? What does he gain? Her voice carried doubt, but deep inside she prayed the answer was simple. Maybe he truly meant to help. The farmer heard their quiet words, but he did not turn. He knew what they were thinking. Everyone had always told him that helping outsiders would bring ruin, yet his heart refused to listen. He remembered how the marketplace had stared at him, their eyes sharp with judgment. He knew that by the next morning the whole colony would be whispering his name with anger. Still, he walked on. At last they reached the edge of the fields. Stretched out before them were rows of dark soil, freshly tilled, waiting for the season's crops. A small wooden house stood at the center, smoke rising faintly from its chimney. The barn loomed beside it, weathered but strong, filled with tools and animals. It was not much, but to the widows it looked like a palace compared to the cold streets. The farmer stopped and turned to face them. This is my land. It is not rich, it is not grand, but it is honest. His eyes narrowed slightly. If you work here, you must understand there will be no easy days. The soil is stubborn, the weather is cruel. You will sweat, you will ache, but you will also eat, and you will have a roof to keep you safe. The widows lowered their heads, overwhelmed. The middle widow stepped forward, her voice shaking. We are not afraid of hard work. All we ask is a chance. No one else has given us even that. The farmer studied her, then nodded. Then tomorrow at sunrise, you begin. Inside the house, the widows found a small room with plain beds and thin blankets. It was simple, but it was more than they had dreamed of. They sat together on the wooden floor, their hands trembling as they touched the blankets, almost afraid it would vanish, like a dream. For the first time in months they slept under a roof without fear of being chased away. But outside the colony was not silent. Word had spread quickly. In the tavern, men slammed their cups on tables, cursing the farmer's name. He brings aliens onto human land, one spat. Next thing you know, they will steal from us, curse our harvest, bring disease. Another man shook his head. He has lost his mind. Helping widows from their race is like inviting death itself. By morning, the whispers turned to anger. Neighbors came to the edge of his field, watching from a distance. Some muttered insults, others made threats. The widows saw them, fear tightening their throats. The youngest asked softly, Why do they hate us so much? We have done nothing. The farmer's face grew hard. People fear what they do not understand, and fear quickly turns to hate. He paused, his voice steady. But as long as you are under my roof, no one will harm you. The widows exchanged glances. They had never known protection before. Their own people had abandoned them. Yet here was a human, standing against his own kind to give them safety. That day, work began. The widows rose before the sun, as the farmer had promised. They learned to carry water, to spread seed, to mend fences. Their hands bled, their muscles screamed, but they did not complain. Each swing of the hoe, each step in the field, felt like proof that they belonged here. As the hours passed, the farmer watched them closely. He saw the determination, in their movements, the fire in their eyes. These were not weak, cursed souls, as the colony believed. These were survivors, fighting every second to earn dignity. By evening, the farm carried a new rhythm. The widows moved with purpose, their laughter faint but real when they stumbled together over tools. The farmer even caught himself smiling, a rare sight since the day he lost his wife. But beyond the farm's borders, shadows gathered. The colony's resentment did not fade. Men spoke of teaching the farmer a lesson. Women whispered that his land would rot. Children repeated their parents' words, pointing at the widows with cruel names. The human farmer knew trouble was coming. He could see it in the eyes of the men who passed his field, could hear it in their mocking voices. But he stood tall. He had made his choice, and though danger waited in the dark, he would not turn back. As night fell, the three widows sat by the small fire in the kitchen, their faces lit by the flames. They shared stories of their lost husbands, their broken villages, their journey across the stars. The farmer listened quietly, saying little, but every word dug into his heart. They were not curses. They were not burdens. They were lives worth saving. And though the colony hated them, though whispers promised storm and fire, the farmer knew one truth. His choice was not a mistake. It was the beginning of something far greater. Morning broke over the farm with a pale golden light spilling across the fields. The three widows woke at the sound of the rooster's cry, their bodies still sore from the long walk and the heavy work of the day before. They rose quietly, afraid to appear lazy, afraid that even this farmer who had offered them shelter might regret his choice if they showed weakness. The farmer was already outside, tightening the ropes around the water barrels. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of responsibility. He glanced at the widows as they stepped into the morning air, their hands ready, their faces set with determination. "Today will be harder," he said simply. "The fields are wide, the soil is rough. You will learn, but it will not be easy." The widows nodded. They had no choice but to endure. The first task was carrying water. The buckets were heavy and the path uneven. The youngest widow tried to balance them, but her arms shook and the water sloshed over the edge, soaking her dress. She bit her lip, holding back tears of frustration. The farmer stepped closer, steadying one of the buckets with his hand. "Do not fight the weight alone," he said. "Use your shoulder. Let the bucket lean against you. The ground is an enemy, but you can still walk with strength." She tried again, this time using his advice, and though the water still spilled, she reached the rows of dry soil without falling. The oldest widow worked at the fences. The wood was cracked, the nails rusted, and her hands grew raw as she hammered and tied the planks back together. Every strike reminded her of her lost home, where she had once mended walls for her own family. Her breath came hard, but she did not stop. The middle widow was sent to the barn. She learned how to feed the animals, how to calm the restless cows, how to spread straw across the floor. At first, the creatures shied away from her alien scent, their hooves stamping nervously. But she spoke to them softly, her voice gentle, and slowly they drew nearer, accepting her presence. By midday, the widows were drenched in sweat, their muscles burning. They wanted to collapse, but when they looked at the farmer, they saw a man who worked harder than all of them. His hands were thick with calluses, his back bent but unbroken as he plowed the earth. He did not complain, so neither did they. The sun burned high in the sky, and the widows felt the sting of heat against their skin. Still, they pressed on. Hunger gnawed at them, but food would only come after the work was done. The farmer finally called them inside when the light began to fade. Their steps were slow, their bodies trembling. but in their eyes was a strange glow, a pride they had not felt in years. Inside the kitchen, the farmer placed bread and stew on the table. The smell alone was enough to make the widows tremble, with gratitude. They ate quickly at first, then slowed, realizing they were no longer fighting for scraps. For the first time in so long, they ate in peace. After the meal, they sat by the fire. The farmer listened as the widows spoke of their past. The oldest widow told of her husband, a soldier who had never returned from war. The middle one whispered about her children, lost to sickness when medicine had been denied to her people. The youngest cried as she recalled how her own village had called her cursed, casting her into the streets. The farmer did not interrupt. He simply sat in silence, his hands resting on his knees, his heart heavy. Their words reminded him of his own loss, the night his wife had died in his arms. He understood their grief in a way words could not express. Outside, the colony still whispered. Neighbors passed by his land, pointing, sneering, muttering about curses and bad luck. They said the widows would bring ruin, that the farmer's kindness would destroy him. The widows heard the voices sometimes, faint but cruel. Fear curled inside them, but when they looked at the farmer, standing tall against the noise, they felt a fragile hope. Days turned into weeks. The widows grew stronger. Their hands toughened, their backs no longer bent so quickly. They began to laugh together when they stumbled, to sing quietly while working the fields. The farm was still poor, the work still endless, but something had changed. It was no longer only survival. It was life. The farmer noticed too. The fields began to look healthier, the animals calmer. It was as if the land itself responded to the widow's effort. He wondered if the colony's whispers of curses were not curses at all, but lies born from fear and hate. One evening, after a long day, the farmer stood at the edge of his land, watching the widows carry the last buckets of water. The setting sun bathed them in orange light, their faces tired but proud. A thought crossed his mind, quiet but powerful. Perhaps this is what family means, not blood, not race, but those who choose to stand with you against the world. But shadows were never far. Rumors spread faster now, sharper, more dangerous. Some neighbors began to speak of driving the widows out by force. Others whispered about burning the farm to rid the colony of their presence. The widows could feel the tension growing in the air, like a storm waiting beyond the hills. Yet for the first time in years, they also felt strength rising inside them. They had been broken and abandoned, but here, with this human farmer, they were no longer invisible. The struggle on the farm was not just against soil and weather. It was against fear, against hate, against the weight of a world that wanted them gone. And though the battle was far from over, one truth was clear. Their lives had begun to change. The farm had begun to change. Crops pushed through the soil, green and strong under the widow's careful hands. The animals in the barn no longer shied away from their touch. Even the air around the farmhouse carried a lighter feeling, as if life itself had begun to return. For the farmer, these were signs of hope. For the widows, these were proof that they were not cursed. But beyond the fences, the colony whispered louder with every passing day. Men at the tavern muttered that the farmer had betrayed his own kind. Women gathering water told each other that the farm would soon rot. Children repeated cruel words they had heard from their parents, pointing at the widows whenever they passed. And each night shadows lingered at the edge of the fields, watching the farmhouse with silent hatred. The widows felt it most of all. Whenever they went to the market, people turned their backs, refusing to meet their eyes. Some spat on the ground as they walked by. The youngest widow, whose heart was still fragile, cried in silence when she thought no one was looking. She whispered to the others, "Perhaps we should leave, before they bring harm to him." The oldest widow shook her head. "We will not run again. We have found a place to work, a place where we are treated as more than shadows. If we leave now, hatred wins." The farmer heard their fears but stood firm. "You are not alone," he told them. "As long as you are here, you will have my roof, my field, and my protection." Still, he knew the storm was building. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a group of men came to the edge of the farm. They carried no weapons in sight, but their voices were sharp and filled with venom. "Farmer," one of them called, "you shame your people. You bring these alien widows to our land and you expect us to stay silent. You spit on our traditions. You spit on your own kind." The farmer stepped forward, his stance unshaken. The widows stood behind him, their hands trembling but their eyes fixed on the ground. "They work," the farmer answered. "They sweat for every seed in the soil, every drop of water on these fields. They ask for nothing but the right to live, with dignity." "How is that a curse?" the men sneered. "They do not belong. They never will. If you will not send them away, we will." For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. The farmer's eyes hardened. His voice was steady, each word striking like iron. "This land is mine. What happens here is not yours to command. If you try to harm them, you will have to face me first." The men muttered among themselves, anger flashing in their eyes. But they turned back toward the colony, their shadows stretching long across the ground as the last light of the sun faded. The widows breathed shakily, their fear still sharp. The youngest clutched her chest. "They will come back," she whispered. The farmer nodded. "Yes, they will. Hatred does not disappear because you speak against it. But we will stand." That night, the widows could not sleep. Every creak of the old wooden house made them jump. Every gust of wind against the shutters felt like a warning. The middle widow prayed silently, asking for strength she was not sure she still had. The oldest sat awake, staring into the dark, her mind heavy with memories of other nights filled with threats and loss. When morning came, they forced themselves back to work. Fear lingered, but so did determination. The youngest, though trembling, carried the water buckets without dropping them. The middle widow brushed the cows with steady hands. The oldest swung the hoe into the soil, her back straight, her movements strong. The farmer watched them, pride in his heart. They were no longer shadows of sorrow. They were becoming something more, fighters, survivors, workers who refused to be broken. But the colony's anger did not fade. Stones began to appear on the path leading to the farmhouse. Some were small, harmless, but others were large, thrown with force. One evening, a rotten egg burst against the farmhouse wall, leaving a sour smell that carried through the night. The widows cleaned it silently, their faces pale. The farmer's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. He wanted to strike back, to silence the cowards who attacked from the dark. But he also knew that violence would only bring more fire. Instead, he stood guard at night, a lantern in his hand, his eyes sharp as he watched the fields. The widows often joined him, sitting quietly on the porch, their presence a reminder that he was not alone in this fight. One night, as the stars shone cold and bright above, the youngest widow whispered, "Why do you risk so much for us? They will ruin you because of us." The farmer turned to her, his gaze steady. "Because once I was broken too. When my wife died, people turned their eyes away from me. I know what it feels like to be left in the shadows. I will not let it happen to you." The widows said nothing, but their hearts swelled with a warmth they had not felt in years. For the first time, they believed that perhaps they were not curses. Perhaps they were worth saving. The shadows of hatred had grown darker, closer, sharper. The colony's anger was not done. But inside that small farmhouse, 4 souls, 1 human, 3 alien widows, stood together against the rising storm. And sometimes unity itself was the most dangerous weapon of all. The storm of hatred had not vanished, but the farm continued to breathe with life. Weeks passed and the fields grew greener, the soil answering to the widows' steady care. Where once the ground had been dry and stubborn, now shoots of wheat and corn pushed upward with surprising strength. The farm, once struggling, began to look alive again. The widows worked from dawn until the stars filled the sky. Their hands toughened, their steps grew steady, and their fear slowly softened into determination. The youngest, who had once cried when buckets slipped from her hands, now carried them with confidence, water spilling only a little as she walked across the rows. The middle widow sang softly while feeding the animals, her voice calming restless creatures that had once kicked against her presence. The oldest guided the others, her patience shaping their clumsy efforts into skill. The farmer noticed the change. At first, he had watched them closely, worried they might break under the weight of the work. But now, when he looked at them, he saw strength returning to their bodies and light flickering in their eyes. They were not burdens. They were not curses. They were workers, partners, and, though none of them dared to say it yet, family. When harvest season came, the widows rose before the sun, their hearts trembling with anticipation. This would be the first true test of their efforts. The farmer sharpened his tools and led them into the golden fields. Together, they cut the stalks, bound them into bundles, and carried them back to the barn. The work was endless, yet every load brought a sense of triumph. By evening, sweat dripped down their faces, their arms ached, and their backs bent with exhaustion, but they smiled. The barn filled with grain, the farmhouse filled with the smell of bread baking and laughter, soft and uncertain at first, began to echo against the wooden walls. For the widows, this was more than food. This was proof that they could create life again, that they could rise above the whispers of curses. Each grain of wheat felt like a stone laid into the foundation of a new future. One evening, after a long day of harvesting, the farmer gathered them on the porch. The sun dipped low, painting the sky orange and red. He looked at the filled barn and then at the three women who sat beside him, their faces glowing in the fading light. "This farm lives because of your hands," he said. His voice was steady but warm. "You came here with nothing, and now you have given back more than I ever expected." The widows lowered their heads, their throats tightening. The oldest whispered, "No one has spoken to us like this before. We were called curses, burdens, outcasts. Yet here, you speak as if we matter." The farmer nodded. "You do matter. To me, and to this land. You are part of it now." The youngest widow's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of something softer. Hope. The days that followed carried the same rhythm: work in the fields, meals in the kitchen, quiet stories shared by the fire. The widows began to laugh more easily, to sing louder while they worked. Sometimes when the farmer walked past, he would find them joking with each other, their voices carrying joy instead of fear. The colony noticed. Neighbors who passed the farm could not deny what they saw: the crops standing tall, the barn filled with animals, the farmhouse alive with warmth. Some shook their heads, muttering that it was only temporary, that soon disaster would strike. But others began to wonder quietly if perhaps they had been wrong all along. Yet not all hearts softened. A group of men in the tavern spat bitter words. "He may harvest now, but curses wait like fire in the dark. Mark my words, his kindness will ruin him." Their voices carried venom, their eyes sharp with jealousy. The widows sensed it. Even in their laughter, a shadow lingered. The youngest sometimes paused while carrying water, staring at the hills as if expecting figures to appear in the night. The middle widow tightened her grip on the barn doors each evening, afraid someone would slip inside. The oldest stayed awake longer, her eyes watching the horizon, knowing storms did not vanish so easily. Still, they did not stop. When the first loaves of bread from the harvest came out of the oven, the farmhouse filled with the warm, rich scent of wheat and hope. The widows placed the bread on the table, their hands trembling as they broke pieces apart. They ate together, their hearts swelling with pride. This was not a meal of survival. It was a meal of victory. The farmer looked at them across the table, his chest tightening with something he had not felt in years. He remembered the nights of silence after his wife's death, the emptiness that had haunted his house. Now there was life again, voices, laughter, hope. He realized that though he had given them shelter, they had given him something greater in return. They had filled his home with family once more. But hope is fragile, and shadows never sleep. As the harvest continued, rumors spread darker than before. Some whispered that the widows had bewitched the soil, forcing it to grow unnaturally. Others claimed that the farmer had betrayed his people for alien hands, and in the deep hours of the night, the farmer sometimes heard footsteps on the road, lingering too long outside the farmhouse before fading away. The widows, though proud of their work, felt the fear pressing closer. Yet every morning when the sun rose and the fields glowed with gold, they carried on, for they had found something worth protecting: dignity, belonging, and a fragile family born not of blood but of choice. And even as shadows gathered, the harvest of hope was theirs. The harvest had brought joy, but it also sharpened envy. The farm stood strong, the fields alive, the barn full, while others in the colony struggled. To some it was proof that the widows were a blessing, but to others it was evidence of a darker lie: that the widows had bewitched the land, that the farmer had traded humanity for alien curses. Whispers turned into threats, and threats, as the farmer knew well, would soon turn into something worse. The night was quiet when it came. The moon hung pale and cold above the farmhouse, casting long shadows across the fields. The widows had gone to bed after a long day, their bodies aching but their hearts warm. The farmer sat awake by the window, a lantern beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had learned to wait for the dark, for that was when hatred moved. At first he thought the faint glow beyond the barn was only moonlight, but then he smelled it. Smoke, sharp, bitter, rising fast. His chest tightened. He grabbed his coat and ran into the night. The barn was on fire. Flames licked the old wooden beams, crackling as they spread upward. The animals screamed inside, hooves pounding in panic. The fire roared, feeding on dry straw, its heat pressing back the air. Shadows moved at the edge of the fields, men slipping away into the dark, their faces hidden, their laughter carried by the wind. The farmers' fists clenched, but there was no time to chase them. The widows had come running, their eyes wide with horror. The youngest gasped, her voice breaking. "They will kill the animals. They will burn everything." The farmer's voice was sharp and steady. "No, they will not. Not while we stand." Together, they threw buckets of water, each drop swallowed by the hungry flames. The widows coughed as smoke stung their lungs, but they did not stop. The middle widow grabbed a shovel, beating back burning straw. The oldest tied a cloth over her face and forced the barn doors open, shouting at the animals. Cows stumbled into the night, terrified, their bodies brushing past her. Chickens scattered into the dirt. The youngest widow, though trembling, darted inside to untie a frightened horse. Flames fell from the roof, and for a heartbeat it seemed she would not come back out. But then she emerged, dragging the animal behind her, her face streaked with soot, her eyes blazing with courage. The farmer pulled her to safety, his heart pounding with both fear and pride. He turned back to the barn. A beam cracked above, glowing red, ready to fall. For a moment he thought of his wife's voice, the promise he had made to protect those who needed him. Then he pushed forward, refusing to let fire take all that they had built. The widows fought beside him. Their hands bled, their throats burned, their bodies shook, but they did not give in. They carried water, beat down sparks, dragged tools, and feet away from the fire's reach. Every second felt like an eternity, the flames threatening to consume not just the barn, but their fragile new life. At last, as dawn began to touch the horizon, the fire weakened. The barn was scarred, its roof half gone, but it still stood. The animals huddled together in the field, alive. The widows collapsed onto the dirt, coughing and gasping, their faces black with soot, their clothes torn. The farmer sank beside them, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the smoking ruin. They had survived. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the crackle of dying flames. Then the oldest widow whispered, her voice raw but strong. "They tried to break us, but we are still here." The farmer looked at her, then at the others. The youngest hand still shook, but her eyes burned with defiance. The middle widow pressed her palm against the ground, steadying herself, as if claiming the soil as her own. He realized then that something had changed. They were no longer just widows in need of shelter. They were fighters who had stood against fire and hate and refused to fall. But the shadows of hatred had not vanished. The men who had lit the flames would return, bolder next time. The farmer knew it. The widows knew it. This was not the end of their struggle. It was only the beginning. As the first rays of the sun touched the farmer stood tall, his hand resting on the shoulder of the youngest widow. His voice was steady, heavy with resolve. They will not take this from us. This farm is ours. This family is ours, and we will protect it, together. The widows rose beside him, their bodies weary but unbroken. The fire had been a test, and they had endured. What came next would be harder, darker, perhaps even deadlier. But now they had something worth fighting for. Hope, belonging, family, and even fire could not destroy that. The farm smelled of smoke for days after the fire, its blackened beams standing like broken teeth against the sky. Yet in the silence of the fields, life had not ended. The animals still grazed, the crops still stood, and the people who had fought through the flames still breathed. The three alien widows carried themselves differently now. Their hands were burned, their clothes patched with soot, but their eyes no longer held the empty weight of despair. They had stood inside the fire and walked out alive. That memory burned brighter than fear. The farmer, too, had changed. He no longer looked at them as guests or workers. He looked at them as something more, though he did not yet have the words for it. In the nights that followed, he often sat on the porch, staring at the stars, listening to the soft murmur of the widows' voices from inside the house. For the first time since his wife's death, the house did not feel hollow. It felt alive. But the colony had not softened. The morning after the fire, people gathered at the marketplace, whispering in sharp voices. Some claimed the widows had cursed the barn themselves to win the farmer's sympathy. Others said the farm's survival proved they had used alien magic. Hatred burned like dry straw, waiting for another spark. The widows heard the whispers, but they did not bow their heads. They walked through the market with their shoulders straight, baskets in hand, voices steady. The youngest even looked into the eyes of those who glared at her, refusing to flinch. She had once trembled in silence, but now she carried the strength of fire within her. One afternoon, as the widows worked in the fields, a group of children from the colony approached. They stood at the edge of the fence, unsure, their eyes wide with curiosity. For months they had been told the widows were cursed, dangerous, unclean. But now they saw three women bent over the soil, their hands planting life into the earth. The youngest widow noticed them first. Instead of sending them away, she smiled softly. "Do you want to help?" she asked. The children glanced at each other, nervous, then slipped through the fence. Soon, small hands were dropping seeds into the dirt, covering them gently. The widows guided them with patient voices, teaching them how to place each seed, how to pat down the soil. For a brief moment, laughter replaced fear. When the farmer saw this, his chest tightened. He knew the battle with the colony was not over, but he also knew that something powerful had begun. Children had seen the truth with their own eyes, and truth was harder to silence than rumors. That evening, as the widows prepared bread, the farmer spoke. His voice was quiet but heavy with meaning. "You came here with nothing but sorrow. You asked only for work, but you have given me more than I can measure. You gave life back to this land, you gave warmth back to this house, and you gave me a family again." The widows froze, their hands still on the bread. The oldest lowered her head, her eyes filling with tears. "We thought we had lost everything. Our people cast us aside. Your people hated us. But here, we found shelter. We found dignity. And now, we have found you." The farmer nodded. His gaze moved across each of them, steady and firm. "You are not outsiders anymore. This farm is your home as much as it is mine. You are my family of choice." The words fell into the room like a blessing. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the Youngest widow sobbed, not from grief but from relief. The middle widow placed her hand over her heart, whispering thanks to stars she had once thought abandoned her. The oldest smiled through her tears, the lines of sorrow on her face softening for the first time in years. From that night onward, the farmhouse was no longer one man's home. It was a shared place bound by labor, loss, and love. The widows rose each morning not as beggars seeking scraps, but as women who belonged. They laughed more freely, sang while working, and even began to teach the farmer words from their lost language, weaving their culture into his world. The colony still whispered. Some voices grew harsher, others began to quiet, but it no longer mattered as much. The farmer and the widows knew what they were. They had stood against fire, against hunger, against hate, and they had not broken. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields glowed with gold, the farmer stood with the widows at the edge of the land. Together they looked over the crops, the barn standing rebuilt, the animals grazing peacefully. For a long while, none of them spoke. They only breathed in the silence, heavy with meaning. At last the farmer said, "The world may never understand. But here on this soil we have built something no fire, no hatred, no curse can take away." The widows nodded, their faces strong with quiet pride. They were no longer outcasts. They were no longer victims. They were family. A family not given by blood or tradition, but by choice, by courage, by sacrifice, by love born in the ashes of despair. And together, they would face whatever shadows came next.